Karen yells at us for camping. Too bad. We own the land. Owning land was always the dream. Growing up in a small rural town, I was surrounded by endless woods, sparkling creeks, and the kind of open skies that made you feel infinite and small at the same time. Nature wasn't just a backdrop, it was my escape, my playground, my teacher. My childhood was filled with long afternoons climbing oak trees, skipping stones in the creek until my arm ached, and lying in fields watching clouds drift lazily by. Summers were sticky and buzzing with life, and winters were crisp and still, save for the crunch of snow beneath my boots. There was a simplicity to it, a sense of being part of something bigger but gentler than the chaos of life. When I moved to the city for college, all of that felt like it slipped away. The nights were never truly dark, the air never felt clean, and the pace of life was relentless. My job as a civil engineer offered stability and a solid paycheck, but it couldn't fill the void left by the open spaces and quiet moments I'd taken for granted growing up. I started chasing that feeling in other ways: weekend camping trips, hiking adventures, and fishing at any lake or river within driving distance. It helped, but it wasn't the same as having a place to call my own. Turns out I wasn't the only one who felt that way. My closest friends, Chris, Jess, Marcus, and Lexi, had their own reasons for longing to escape the grind. Chris, who was raised by a family of outdoors enthusiasts, always talked about how much he missed the camping trips he'd taken as a kid. Jess, a financial planner, was constantly juggling her high-pressure job and dreamed of unplugging somewhere peaceful. Marcus loved cooking, especially grilling over an open flame, and saw himself hosting cookouts under the stars. And Lexi? Well, Lexi was a wild card. She was drawn to the idea of freedom, of doing something wild and unconventional, of waking up and deciding her day without a calendar or to-do list. We spent years bonding over this shared dream, sitting around countless campfires, beers in hand, talking about that someday we all secretly hoped would come sooner rather than later. Imagine owning a place like this, Chris would say, gesturing toward whatever mountain, lake, or endless stretch of forest we were camping near that weekend. No deadlines, no traffic, just trees and stars. Not to mention no neighbors blasting music at 3 a.m., Jess would add, rolling her eyes. Marcus always chimed in with something grandiose. We could build a little cabin, maybe add a deck, maybe even a hot tub. Why not dream big, right? And Lexi? She'd smirk, raise her drink, and say, why stop at one cabin? Let's go full commune. I called dibs on the yurt. It was always fun to fantasize, but Lexi was the one who finally turned the conversation serious. One night, while we were roasting marshmallows and staring up at the Milky Way, she looked at us and said, why just imagine? Let's actually do it. We laughed at first, thinking she was joking. But Lexi wasn't joking. She laid it out, plain and simple. Look, we all want this, right? So why not start making it happen? Save some money, keep an eye out for land, and when the time's right, we pull the trigger. It's not impossible. The more we thought about it, the more it started to feel doable. Sure, it wouldn't be easy, but if we pooled our resources and stayed disciplined, why couldn't we make it happen? At first, it felt like one of those far-off pipe dreams you throw out after a couple of beers. But something about it stuck. We started taking it seriously. Jess, who loved spreadsheets almost as much as she loved nature, created a detailed savings plan for each of us. Chris, with his encyclopedic knowledge of real estate websites, began researching properties like it was a second job. Marcus volunteered to scope out potential sites on weekends, turning every road trip into a scouting mission. And me, with my civil engineering background, I started sketching out wild ideas for cabins, campsites, and everything in between. Over time, the dream began to take shape. We tightened our budgets, skipped unnecessary luxuries, and kept each other motivated. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the promise of what we were building together. Every dollar saved, every potential property Chris emailed, every late-night brainstorm session brought us closer. And then, after years of planning and saving, we found it. 15 acres of heaven. The land was everything we wanted and more. Rolling hills stretched out like green waves, dotted with oak trees that looked like they belonged in paintings. A gentle stream wound its way through the middle, its waters so clear you could see the stones underneath. The property was just secluded enough to feel like an escape. No honking horns or city lights in sight. The closest road was half a mile away, and the nearest town was about 15 minutes down a two-lane highway. There were a handful of houses nearby, but they were spaced far apart, each one tucked into its own little corner of the countryside. Well, except for one. One house stood right on the edge of our property line, closer than the others. It was a modest two-story place with an immaculate lawn, bright white siding, and, oddly enough, several security cameras mounted at various angles. Stuck out, but we figured it wouldn't be a problem. People who live in rural areas tend to keep to themselves, right? We were too excited to worry about it. We signed the papers, pooled our money, and officially became landowners. This was it, the beginning of our dream. We planned our first trip to the property like it was a major event. Between us, we packed enough gear to survive a month in the wilderness, even though we were only staying for the weekend. Marcus brought his uncle's camper. Jess brought a portable grill. Chris and I handled the tents and tools, while Lexi stocked up on snacks and drinks. Mainly drinks. When we pulled onto the property for the first time as owners, it felt surreal. We parked under the shade of a massive oak tree and got to work setting up camp. The tents went up in no time, and Marcus maneuvered the camper into a perfect spot near the fire pit we planned to dig. It didn't take long for us to settle into the rhythm of the place. By mid-afternoon, we were lounging in camp chairs, beers in hand, marveling at our good fortune. "This is perfect," Chris said, leaning back and staring at the sky. "Absolutely perfect," Jess nodded. All those years of saving actually paid off. "We should name the property," Lexi suggested, poking the fire pit with a stick. "Like, something cool. Camp Freedom? Oak Haven?" Marcus laughed. "How about Booze Creek?" "Sold," I said, raising my bottle. "To Booze Creek." We all laughed and clinked bottles, feeling invincible. For a few blissful hours, everything was exactly as we'd imagined. And then she showed up. It started with a sound. A sharp, high-pitched voice that cut through the air like a knife. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" We froze. Lexi, who had been mid-sip, almost choked on her beer. Emerging from the property line like an angry storm cloud was a woman in a bright pink tracksuit. She was middle-aged, with a severe bob haircut and an expression so sour it could curdle milk. "Who the hell is that?" Marcus whispered. The woman marched closer, her finger jabbing the air in our direction. "This is private property," she shouted. "You can't just set up camp wherever you want." I stood up, confused but trying to keep the peace. Hi, can I help you?" Her eyes narrowed. "What do you think you're doing here?" "We just bought this property," I said, keeping my tone calm. "This is our land." She crossed her arms, clearly unimpressed. "That's impossible. The owner would never sell this land, especially not to a bunch of people like you, people like us." I had no idea what she meant by that, but the condescension in her tone made my blood boil. "Ma'am, I can assure you we did buy it. I can show you the deed if you'd like." "I don't care about your so-called deed," she snapped. "My family has been using this land for over 20 years. This is our land, and you're trespassing." Jess, ever the logical one, stood up beside me. "With all due respect, ma'am, that's not how property ownership works. We worked directly with the seller, and everything is legal. You're welcome to verify it, but—" Karen cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I don't need to verify anything. I know this land better than anyone, and I'm telling you, you're not supposed to be here." She was practically vibrating with anger, her face turning a shade of red I didn't know was possible. Finally, she threw up her hands and said, "Fine. If you won't leave, I'm calling the sheriff." With that, she turned and stormed back toward her house. First, we laughed it off. "Well," Marcus said, cracking open another beer, "that was something." "To our first Karen encounter," Lexi said, raising her bottle. "To Karen." We all cheered, clinking bottles again. But as the day went on, the laughter faded. Every time I glanced toward her house, I saw her watching us from the window, arms crossed and face set in a permanent scowl. Occasionally, she'd step onto her porch, muttering to herself and glaring in our direction. Do you think she actually called the sheriff? Lexi asked as we sat around the fire that night. Jess shook her head. Doubt it. She's bluffing. Even if she did, we're not doing anything illegal. We have the deed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something about the way she'd stormed off, about the venom in her voice stuck with me. As the fire crackled and the stars began to peek through the darkness, I found myself staring toward her house, wondering what she was planning. By the time the sun rose on our second morning at the property, I was starting to believe Karen's threat about calling the sheriff had been empty. We hadn't heard a peep from her since her dramatic departure the day before. Turns out I was wrong. It started with a loud knock on the camper door, an aggressive, insistent pounding that jolted all of us awake. Marcus groaned from the other side of the camper. Who the hell is knocking at? What time is it? Too early, Jess muttered, pulling a blanket over her head. I stumbled toward the door, rubbing sleep out of my eyes. When I opened it, I found myself face to face with a uniformed sheriff's deputy, standing next to a cruiser parked at the edge of our makeshift campsite. Morning, the deputy said, tipping his hat slightly. His expression was neutral, but there was a tiredness in his eyes that told me he didn't really want to be here. You folks mind stepping out for a chat? Behind him, I could see Karen standing near the property line, arms crossed and wearing an expression of smug satisfaction. What's going on? I asked, already bracing for the worst. We got a report of trespassing, the deputy said. Your neighbor over there claims you're on private property without permission. For a second, I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, actually, this is our property. We purchased it last month. I have the deed inside. Do you want to see it? The deputy nodded, and I quickly retrieved the folder where I'd been keeping all the paperwork for the land. By now, the others had shuffled out of the camper, still groggy but curious about what was happening. After a few minutes of reviewing the documents, the deputy handed them back and let out a small sigh. Well, everything checks out. You're definitely the legal owners. Sorry for the inconvenience. Just doing my job. I nodded, grateful for his professionalism, but Karen wasn't going to let it go that easily. You're just going to take their word for it? She shouted, marching closer. They probably forged those papers. My family's been on this land for decades. This isn't right. Ma'am, the deputy said, turning toward her with a tone that suggested he was rapidly losing patience. They've provided legal proof of ownership. There's nothing more I can do here. Karen's face flushed bright red, and for a moment, I thought she might actually explode. Instead, she threw her hands up and stormed back toward her house, muttering under her breath. The deputy gave me a small, sympathetic shrug. I'd suggest keeping your paperwork handy for now. She seems persistent. Before he left, the deputy lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something. Finally, he glanced toward Karen's house and said, Look, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but you should know what you're dealing with. We all leaned in a little, curious. She's the ex-wife of the guy who used to own this land, he explained. Lived over there during their marriage. When they split, he kept this property and she kept the house next door. He sold it to you folks a few months back. But I guess she hasn't taken it well. I felt a pang of unease as his words sank in. Suddenly, her behavior made a twisted kind of sense. This wasn't just some random patch of land to her. It was tied to her past, her history, maybe even her identity. The deputy tipped his hat again and said, Good luck, before climbing into his cruiser and driving off. If we thought that would be the end of it, we were sorely mistaken. Over the next few weeks, Karen's harassment shifted into overdrive. It started with a post in a local Facebook group. Jess stumbled across it one night while scrolling on her phone and immediately burst out laughing. Listen to this, she said, reading aloud. Beware of the new owners. Outsiders who don't care about the community or the land. They're destroying what's left of our countryside and ruining the neighborhood. Is she serious? Lexi asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. Oh, it gets better, Jess said, scrolling down. She's got a bunch of people commenting, neighbors I guess, saying they agree with her. A few of them are even talking about organizing a petition to get us removed. Removed from our own property? Marcus asked, shaking his head. Good luck with that. First, we found it hilarious. But as the days went on, her campaign against us started to feel less funny. She began filing false complaints with every authority she could think of. One afternoon, animal control showed up after Karen accused us of setting traps for stray dogs on the property. The officer took one look around, saw no evidence of traps, and apologized for the unnecessary visit. A week later, the game warden arrived, responding to Karen's claim that we were illegally hunting deer. Once again, the accusation was baseless. We didn't even own hunting gear, let alone use it. Each time, the officials left apologizing for the disruption, but it was clear Karen's goal wasn't to win. It was to wear us down. Through all of this, Karen's obsession with the land became increasingly obvious. She'd sit on her porch for hours, staring at us with a mixture of anger and sadness. Sometimes she'd mutter to herself, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. It wasn't until one particularly tense morning that she finally opened up, though not in a way any of us expected. I was walking near the stream, taking a break from clearing brush, when I spotted her standing at the edge of her property. For a moment, I considered ignoring her, but before I could walk away, she called out, "Do you even know what this land means?" I turned, surprised by the raw emotion in her voice. "My family built everything here," she said, her voice trembling. "We planted those trees. We fished in that stream. Every memory I have of my life is tied to this place. And now you're tearing it apart." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to empathize. Clearly, this land meant the world to her, but another part of me bristled at the accusation. "We're not tearing anything apart," I said carefully. "We're just trying to make it our own." She shook her head, tears in her eyes. "It'll never be yours. You don't understand." Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked away. The final straw came a few days later, when we arranged to have a load of lumber delivered to the property. It was for a small deck we planned to build near the stream. A simple project, nothing intrusive. By the time the lumber arrived, we'd learned to expect Karen's interference. Every delivery, every sound of a hammer or chainsaw, seemed to provoke her. But as annoying as she was, none of us could have imagined what she'd do next. Karen wasn't just angry anymore. She was obsessed. It started on a sunny Saturday morning. We just had a delivery of lumber dropped off by the edge of the property, near the spot we'd chosen for the first cabin. It was an exciting milestone for us, the first tangible sign of our progress. Karen, of course, was watching from her window. By now, her constant surveillance had become so routine that we barely noticed anymore. "She's like a human security camera," Lexi joked as we unloaded supplies. "Too bad she doesn't actually prevent crime." "She is the crime," we laughed. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Karen had been quieter than usual lately, and the silence was unnerving. Later that afternoon, while we were working on clearing brush near the stream, Marcus spotted movement near the pile of lumber. "Hey," he said, squinting. "Is that Karen?" I turned and saw her marching onto the property, a red gas can in one hand and something small and metallic in the other. My stomach dropped. What the hell is she doing? Before we could react, she was at the lumber pile, pouring gasoline over the neatly stacked boards. The smell hit us before we even got close, sharp and acrid in the warm air. "Karen, stop," I shouted, running toward her. She ignored me, pulling out a lighter and flicking it to life. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she tossed the lighter onto the soaked wood. The flames erupted immediately, bright orange and crackling as they devoured the pile. "Get the extinguisher," I yelled, panic surging through me. Marcus and Chris sprinted toward the camper, where we kept a fire extinguisher for emergencies. Meanwhile, Lexi and Jess grabbed shovels, frantically tossing dirt onto the fire to slow it down. By the time Marcus returned with the extinguisher, the flames were already licking at the edge of the grass. He aimed the nozzle and unleashed a blast of foam, dousing the fire in a thick white cloud. It took several minutes of coordinated effort, but we managed to put it out before it could spread any further. When the smoke cleared, Karen was still standing there, frozen in place. Her face was a mix of anger and something else. Desperation, maybe, or disbelief. "You could have killed us," Jess said, her voice shaking with fury. Karen didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the charred remains of the lumber. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone. "That's it," I said, dialing 911. "We're done playing nice." The sheriff arrived within 20 minutes, along with a couple of deputies. By the time they pulled onto the property, Karen was sitting on the ground, hands restrained by zip ties we'd improvised with rope from the camper. "She set the fire," I explained, gesturing toward the scorched lumber. "We've got witnesses. She's been harassing us for weeks. And this time she crossed the line." The sheriff surveyed the scene, taking in the charred wood, the gas can, and the lighter. He nodded grimly. "Ma'am, stand up," he said, motioning for Karen to rise. She didn't resist as they handcuffed her, but she kept muttering under her breath. "It's my land. It's always been my land. They had no right." As they led her toward the cruiser, I felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and, oddly enough, a small pang of pity. No matter how much she'd tormented us, it was clear that this land represented something deeply personal to her. The legal process moved quickly. Karen was charged with attempted arson, reckless endangerment, and property damage. During her trial, she pleaded guilty, her lawyer citing emotional distress as a mitigating factor. The court sentenced her to 7 years in prison, along with a $5,000 fine for reckless endangerment and $2,000 in restitution for the damages she'd caused. For the first time since we'd bought the property, it felt like we could finally breathe. With Karen out of the picture, we threw ourselves into building the retreat we'd always dreamed of. We built 2 beautiful log cabins, each with a wraparound porch that overlooked the stream. Inside, they were cozy and rustic, with wood-burning stoves and hand-built furniture. Chris took the lead on clearing hiking trails, mapping out routes that wound through the hills and circled back to the campsite. Marcus constructed fire pits at strategic spots along the trails, perfect for evening cookouts. Jess coordinated everything like a project manager, making sure we stayed on schedule and within budget. And Lexi? She became our unofficial morale officer, keeping us laughing through the toughest days and ensuring there was always a fresh batch of s'mores at the end of the night. Sitting on the porch of the first cabin one evening, watching the sun dip below the hills, I couldn't help but reflect on everything we'd been through. Karen's obsession with the land had been more than just a nuisance. It had been a test of our patience, our determination, and, frankly, our sanity. But in the end, we'd stood our ground. As frustrating as she was, I couldn't entirely hate her. Her actions were inexcusable, but they came from a place of pain. For her, this land wasn't just a piece of property. It was a symbol of her past, a tether to a life she couldn't let go of.